Welcome to Fear Street.
For the last 10 years, my wife and I have owned and worked on a cattle farm. It's a decent-sized herd, and though it's been tough the last few years, we're making enough to get by comfortably. A few months ago, we welcomed our baby girl, hopefully the first of many kids and grandkids. So my wife took care of her while I managed the farm alone. I didn't mind since cattle are normally pretty easy to handle. But this particular day was different. The herd was skittish and on alert the entire day, which cattle don't normally do unless they smell something they don't like. I assumed there were coyotes somewhere nearby, but for some reason, I couldn't hear them. Coyotes are usually pretty loud, so this was really unnerving. I'd make regular patrols around my land to make sure nothing was where it shouldn't be, usually finding nothing. It was getting pretty late by the time I decided to take one last patrol around the farm. It was already pretty dark, so I wasn't expecting to see much. I was at the opposite side of the farm away from the house when I thought I heard a voice come from the front of me. I was a little confused. We lived in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, and 2 miles from the nearest homestead. It couldn't have been my wife since she was back in the house, leaving me wondering who it was in front of me. I started approaching carefully, only to begin recognizing the voice. It was my wife's. I began wondering why she was all the way out here, rather than with our daughter, until I got closer to the figure standing in front of me. Whoever, or whatever they were, it wasn't my wife. Their back was turned, but I could clearly see they were wearing some sort of fur coat. I stopped before I could get too close and stuttered, "Hello?" The figure didn't answer me, didn't even seem to hear me. "Hello?" I asked again, louder this time. I wish I hadn't. The figure turned, and I clearly saw what it looked like. It looked like a horrifying, misshapen version of my wife, as if she'd been crudely made out of clay. Whatever it was, it didn't speak. Instead, it smiled and started walking towards me, but not like a normal person would, like it wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. It walked slowly as I stood there frozen in fear. 1 step, then another, then another. I tried to scream, to move. Then it looked me in the eyes and said, "Baby, why don't you come over here and help me?" It sounded exactly like my wife, but I suddenly found myself unable to move. It wanted me to approach it, but I ran. It took me minutes to make it back to the house. And just as I was about to enter, I heard a coyote call out in the distance. I hadn't heard coyotes all day, and now I was hearing them. I had to make the choice to either protect my herd or my family, and I chose the latter. I love my cows, I do, but my family comes first. I found my wife in the living room, already having put our daughter to bed. I quickly forced her upstairs and barricaded all 3 of us in the bedroom. I didn't have any time to explain when we heard knocking at the front door, and then we heard the same voice call out to me, "Baby, I'm cold. Please let me in." It still sounded exactly like my wife, who was now standing right next to me. She asked me what was happening, but I had no answers for her. The thing, whatever it was, kept banging on the doors and windows, occasionally trying to convince me to let it in. Sometimes it would be replaced by coyote calls, but usually the only thing we could hear was that thing using the voice of my wife. The very next morning it had gone, and 3 of my cows had been killed. West Virginia's been home to my family for generations, ever since the first settlers came here in the 1700s. In fact, I'm the first of my family to live outside of Virginia since coming here, and my son is the firstborn outside the state. In all that time, stories of skinwalkers were of course passed down from the natives, and through my family. My great-great-grandmother was a native, but I never believed them. I've spent the last 3 months staying at a cabin my dad used to own out in the woods. Solar panels and all. It's quiet, peaceful, and far away from all the crap going on in the world. My wife doesn't really enjoy it all that much, since she's got a bit too much of the city in her. And our son, at 6 months, is too young to care. The cabin is rather nice, as far as most cabins go. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and even a small bath-shower combo. The front of the cabin had a small porch with a bench and light. Simple. Other than the driveway and road leading up to the cabin, there's a 4-meter clearing surrounding it, which itself is surrounded by thick forest. The only other buildings are the tool shed and the waste tank. The nearest town was maybe 40 miles away. Not really that isolated, but isolated enough that it didn't really matter. The night in question happened just last week. We'd just come back after spending the day visiting my mother, and we were more than ready to just call it a day. Jack, my son, was already asleep, which made it easier for us to settle down, and my wife was practically falling asleep herself. For context, we didn't get back to the cabin until well past 10:30, and we'd been up since 5 that morning. So while she put Jack to bed, I went out onto the porch for a quick smoke. The wife doesn't really like me smoking, so I usually take a quick one last thing on the porch, where she doesn't have to smell the smoke. Normally I just sit there for a good 20 to 30 minutes, not really caring all that much about what's going on. Sometimes I'll try to see if I can hear coyotes or wolves, though this particular night, it was oddly quiet. Admittedly, I wasn't really trying, but coyotes especially were common enough that it was rare not to hear a pack of them this far out in the forest. I quickly finished and was about to go inside when I heard a coyote call coming from the forest. The weird thing is, it sounded like the coyote was right in front of the cabin. Then I realized that it didn't really sound like a coyote at all. It sounded like someone making a coyote call, and it was coming from just within the forest, where I couldn't see anything. No one was supposed to be out here but me and my family, but there was someone in the forest right now making coyote noises. What if there was some crazy person watching me and my family? I rushed inside to find my wife in a state of panic and holding Jack. "What's going on?" I asked her. The shocked and scared look on her face said it all. "In there," she said, pointing towards the main bedroom. I rushed in but didn't see anything. Then I looked over at the window. It was open, and there was blood all over it. I rushed back to my wife, and what she told me horrified me. Some sort of weird monster opened the window from the outside and started climbing in. She couldn't get a look at it before grabbing Jack and getting out of there, but she described it as looking like a dog, but bigger, and a little like a person. It sounded like she was describing a werewolf. Either way, we knew we couldn't stay there. We spent the next few days staying with my mother before I returned to the cabin. I went back with my brother and 2 uncles. They spent the entire journey there mocking me about running, knowing full well I kept a gun in the cabin at all times. But they stopped when we got there. The cabin was destroyed. It had caught fire and burned down. Surrounding what had been my cabin were coyote tracks. I don't know if it really was a skinwalker, but from what me and my wife witnessed, I have no reason to doubt it. I was out hiking when I saw it. There's this little country road just outside of town where I live that leads to the next town over, but I wasn't going all the way. Instead, I was heading off to a friend's house. He lives on a farm that grows corn, and it would only take me about an hour to get there if I walked. So I walked. It was around 9:30 at night, and it was late September, so it was already dark outside. I didn't really care and decided to do it anyway. I was maybe 20 minutes away from my friend's house when I started hearing sounds coming from behind me. It wasn't the sound of an approaching car or truck, but it sounded like something was following me. At first, I thought it might just be some stray dog and ignored it. We don't really have any wolves or coyotes in this area, so I wasn't concerned about wild animals attacking me. I kept walking and whatever was behind me kept following. That's when I heard a scream, or howl, I'm not sure. It was coming from behind. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned around. That's when I saw it. I couldn't make out any real details, but it was over 6 feet tall. The arms were long and lanky and ended with what appeared to be dark claws. The head, if it were a head, had 2 pairs of massive antlers that I could just about make out in the moonlight. It was skinny, almost unnaturally so. Whatever it was growling at me. I stood there, terrified at what I was seeing. Then it started moving towards me. 1 step, then another. On the 3rd step, I snapped out of it and ran towards my friend's house. I could hear it trying to catch up with me, but it also sounded like it was struggling to run on 2 legs. I managed to reach the lit road that led up to my friend's house through his family farm and kept running up it. I kept banging on his door until he let me in before I realized that it wasn't actually chasing me anymore. He let me in and asked me what was going on. But before I could tell him, we both heard the same scream from before. It was coming from outside, just far enough away that it would have come from the start of the road that I had just run down. I'm not sure if that was a skinwalker, or just a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely, and honestly I don't care. I just hope I never have to see that thing again. This just happened last night, and I'm still unsure if what I saw was real or not. I work as a truck driver, and for the last few weeks I've been hauling log piles back and forth between various sites down in Louisiana. It's long hours, stressful as all hell, but pays pretty good. Last night I was on my way to a logging camp out in the middle of nowhere when my truck suddenly broke down. It was utter crap, since I had had it checked out not 3 days ago, and the mechanics had said it was all fine. For the record, I keep my truck in good order since I own it, and it's my livelihood down the drain if it ever breaks down. I wasn't carrying any lumber at the time but was still on a deadline, so I had to get on the radio and call ahead to tell the foreman I was going to be late due to issues with my engine. However, when I tried to get through, all I could hear back was static. My radio was just as screwed as my truck. Annoyed, I tried using my phone, and then I realized I was so far out that I wasn't getting any signal out there. So I did the next best thing and decided to try and take a look for myself. If I could get the truck moving, then I could get it to the camp and have one of the on-site engineers look at it. I had barely gotten out when the smell hit me. This sounds weird, but I could smell rotten meat. It was so thick and strong that I immediately threw up, right there and then. I turned back towards the truck and was about to climb back in to get a bottle of water when I heard it. A screech that shook me to my core. It was coming from behind me. I turned to look and saw nothing. I knew there was a forest in front of me. I'd been driving through a stretch of forest by this point for a good hour or so, but it was so dark I couldn't see anything past the edge of the road. Suddenly, another loud screech came from just ahead of my truck, and again, I turned to see what was making the noise. I really wish I hadn't. Standing right there was this monster. That's the best way I can describe it. It was tall and skinny, and looked as if it had been starving itself. There were these weird antlers on its head that seemed to go everywhere at once. There was very little hair. Instead, it had this sort of gray skin that looked to be peeling off all over. The only reason I could see so much detail is that the headlights on my truck suddenly came on, giving me a very clear look at whatever this thing was. It snarled at me and started coming towards me, but then stopped and turned towards the road ahead of my truck. Another pair of headlights could only mean another vehicle was coming down the road. I took the opportunity to get back into my truck, but by the time I looked back out to where that thing was, it was long gone. The vehicle approaching just drove past without stopping. My truck suddenly started just as quickly as that thing had vanished. I didn't wait around to find out if it would return. I only mentioned it to one person when I got to the logging camp, to someone I know regularly hunts in these very woods. He told me it was a Skinwalker, but I don't even know what that is. All I know is that I never want to see it again. I dreamt of skinwalkers long before I actually ever saw one. Well, I say dream. It was always more of a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, I'd find myself on this road, surrounded by forest. No matter how far I walked, I'd never come across any signs of other people. No cars, no gas stations, nothing. Not even a sign that would tell me where I was. After what felt like hours of walking, I'd eventually get to a solitary streetlight, just randomly placed out in the middle of nowhere. However, it was always placed in the middle of this road, rather than to the side. It was always on, and the light allowed me to see just enough to catch a glimpse of a figure out in the darkness. It was just beyond the reach of the streetlight opposite me. I felt compelled to call out, to try and call for help from this mysterious figure. But then it would turn around as soon as it noticed me and step into the light. What I saw would always make me sick. A tall thing with pale gray skin, a rotted deer's head with a large set of antlers and long gangly arms and legs. I stood there, frozen in fear and sick to my stomach as it started coming towards me. It would eventually reach out to me and grab me by the head with one hand, picking me up as the other arm prepared to decapitate me. But I'd always wake up right before it actually hit me. The dream stopped a few years ago when I had my real-life encounter. It was late one day, and I was driving home after spending Christmas with my parents when my car suddenly stopped. I checked the gas gauge and realized that I was out. I had just passed a gas station not 20 minutes before and had an empty gas can in my trunk, so after retrieving it I started to walk back. It took longer than I expected, and I started to suspect that the gas station was a little further than I thought when I saw it. Ahead of me was a pair of streetlights. Unlike in my dream, they were placed normally alongside the road, but what I saw lit up was even more horrifying than any nightmare I'd had previously. Lit up on the road was that thing I'd seen in my dreams, holding another person. I saw it decapitate him, then turn around and notice me, but with this huge grin on its face and this look in its eyes. Oh God, I'll never forget that look. I don't know how or why, but I just started running back to my car and locked myself inside. What I didn't know at first was that it followed me and that it saw me lock myself into my car. But I quickly noticed when it tried to approach from behind me. Now, I always carry a handgun in my car, just in case I ever need it. So I did what I thought would be a good idea. I rolled down my window and fired a few shots at it, I think, missing it, but scaring it off for the time being. But it always came back. The weirdest thing was that it never kept the same shape. It would sometimes look like a coyote, or a person, or a deer, but it always had the head of a deer, long gangly limbs, and that disgusting pale skin that seemed like it was rotting off. Sometimes, though, it moved its mouth as if it were trying to speak to me, but I never actually heard any sounds come from it, whatever it was. Eventually, it seemed to lose interest in me and left the way it came just as the sun started to rise. I stayed in my car for another few hours before making another attempt at finding the gas station. Fortunately, I never saw that thing again, and I'm thankful for that.